So Professor Schwartz is the Charles Batchelor Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at Columbia University. He was the founding director in 1985 of the National Science Foundation-sponsored Center for Telecommunications Research. Before he joined Columbia, he was a project engineer at Sperry Gyroscope. Most of you know that Sperry Gyroscope was one of the companies that helped us win World War II. And he worked on radar. He was also professor of electrical engineering at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, and he served as department head for 4 years. He's won the 1984 IEEE Education Medal, the Cooper Union Communications Technology Gain Done Medal, the New York City Mayor's Award for Excellence in Technology, the Eta Kappa Nu Eminent Member Award, and I could go on and on. He's also the founding chair of the IEEE Communications Society History Committee and the founding editor of the IEEE Communications Magazine History Column. So without further ado, Professor Schwartz.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me in the back there? I'll try to speak up if possible. I'm surprised that he said that in this particular place there are no loudspeakers all over the place, just this portable system. We'll do the best we can. What can we say? He's going to sue the place. Anyway, it's my pleasure to be here to talk about Major Edwin Howard Armstrong. Apparently, as a young man, he liked to call himself Howard Armstrong, so whatever you want to call him, or Major Armstrong. At any rate, he's a product of Columbia University, and we're proud to say that he's probably one of our most eminent, if not most eminent, members of the Electrical Engineering Department at Columbia, graduates, I should say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk first about the background of what was going on at Columbia at the time he became a student, and his student years there, and then his inventions of various kinds that John has already told you about. I have to find which button to use. That's it. I've got it.
Okay. Oh, you can use it quicker.
Yeah. Oh, all right. Okay. As I say, I'll be talking first about Armstrong as a student. The background, which means the Electrical Engineering Department program at Columbia that he came out of, which made him the inventor that he was. His early days as a student inventor, because we'll see that his first major invention of a supergenerative receiver was done while he was a junior at Columbia University. Very inventive guy early on. And then finally, the most important invention, Armstrong and his wideband low noise FM. Okay, here he is as a student. He was born on December 10th, 1890, and died in 1954, unfortunately, by suicide, as we'll see. It's not known by many people. I'll come back to that at the end very briefly. He was a student at Columbia from 1909 to 1913, and the courses he took, which are typical of those days, early days of radio, early days of teletype. So, and the focus there was on machinery, power. So he took courses in electrical engineering, DC and AC machinery, the theory of electromagnetism, telegraphy, telephony, which was all new at that time, a lot of physics, a lot of mathematics, chemistry, civil engineering, mechanical engineering. We don't do that anymore. And now then the focus was on these earlier things. Now, a background to this, the electrical engineering at Columbia was introduced in 1889 as a 2-year program way downtown. Columbia is now uptown. It was down on 49th Street and Madison Avenue. And there were two teachers for that program. One man named Crocker, who taught the courses in power, like DC and AC, and a very famous Michael Pupin. In fact, a building at Columbia is named after the physics building at Columbia. He became a very famous inventor. And look at the figures they started at, $2,000 a year, $1,500 a year. Of course, you're up at to modern times, maybe it'll be $25,000 a year. The figures are still rather low. Now, the electrical engineering department was established in 1889 following a letter by Thomas Edison in 1882, and I've read the letter. It's posted actually on the board of the electrical engineering department of Columbia, and he told the trustees of Columbia, you really should be establishing electrical engineering. Engineering by itself was rather new, and there was very little electrical engineering, and most of it in the country was taught in the physics departments, but he suggested setting this up. Now, when you look through the documents, as I did at Columbia Rare Books Library, to have all the documents of the trustees, there's a 7-year delay in the trustees responding to him. And I was wondering why. Unfortunately, the details are missing. When I checked the engineering school, it turns out the documents of their faculty in those days were washed out in a water washout at the bottom of the building, and they don't exist anymore. So I come up with conjectures. And one conjecture is it takes money to do this, set up a new department, so somewhere along the line they were worried about the money. But the second main question at that time was, since most electrical engineering in universities all over the country had been set up just a few years before, were in physics, maybe it should be in physics. But here's an interesting conjecture. They had one professor of mechanical engineering at Columbia at the time, no mechanical engineering department, just a professor. And it could be that he insisted it be housed as part of a new mechanical engineering department. Now, why? Just a conjecture. Well, I read back in those days of 1887, a Columbia Quarterly on Engineering, a quote from him. This is this professor. Electrical engineering is but one of the forces that mechanical engineers should be competent to direct. The electrical engineer should therefore be first an ME. And as a matter of fact, a journal of that day, which I looked up, Electrician of 1883, the future electrical engineer will be essentially a mechanical engineer. Why? Another document by this professor of mechanical engineering, which he wrote, which I read, says the following. What is electrical engineering? It consists of the generation of electricity. Well, how do you generate it? With steam engines in those days. Therefore, it's mechanical engineering. What's the recipient? Motors. Motors are mechanical engineering devices. In between is something called transmission. And he says that's a minor thing. Seriously. So that's my conjecture. He was holding up the whole works. But anyway, they finally established it. And by 1897, 5 years later, the program was, quote, the most successful among the established Eastern schools, due largely to Crocker. He's the one man I mentioned, the power guy, and his engineering ability. He'd come out of an engineering firm that he built up. And Columbia's predisposition for applied science, that was Michael Pupin. It's a combination of the two. Now, by this time, when the first engineers graduated, this man Crocker was chair, and Pupin became professor of electromechanics, a separate department. Now, Armstrong comes along now a few years later, and during his years there, the department had grown from 2 people to 6 people on the staff. Crocker, the chair, had died, an older man, and died, and there was a Professor Slichter in charge, a number of assistant professors, a number of instructors, and Pupin, the professor of electromechanics. And each of these men played a strong role in Armstrong's development. We'll see as he came along with his first major invention, they were there to help him. Now, here he is as a student. He had to take the required courses, but he was most interested in telegraphy taught by this assistant professor, Arendt. And one of the faculty members there wrote about him saying he was very secretive, always puttering around, secretive in his work. And this is a characteristic of his work later on, too, we'll see. One reason being that he'd been sued for his patents, so he became further secretive. Now, in 1911, in his junior year, he came to the attention of Michael Pupin, who was taking his course in electricity and magnetism. And at that time, in 1911, as a junior, he began to study of grid-based tubes. Now, those of you who remember, are old enough to remember, once upon a time before semiconductors, we had vacuum tubes. And the triode, a vacuum tube with a grid in it, had been invented in the early part of the 20th century, just a few years before this. And Armstrong was puttering around with these things. And he began playing with these. For the first time, he began to get amplification taking place. With the grid structure, you got amplification. With a diode, just as a triode. With just the anode and the cathode, you get just rectification but no amplification. You needed that grid. And he was starting to play around with this. And in addition, by increasing the feedback, he managed a year later in 1912 to get tube oscillations. So he demonstrated two things, that the tube can serve as an oscillator and can serve as an amplifier. And the oscillation was called regeneration in those days. Here's a picture of Armstrong as a junior. And you'll see him gradually getting older as we show more pictures, as everybody gets older, myself included, obviously. So there he is, a nice young man as a junior. Now, in 1913, he applied for a patent for his regenerative device, his regenerative receiver. Witnessed and notarized. His work was supported by 2 or more of the faculty we saw before. They were all responsive to this young man who was showing signs of inventive genius at this point, as a junior. He graduated in 1913 and was kept on at Columbia as an assistant. Now, this is just prior to World War I, and the Navy had started setting up classes all over the country in radio. Of course, they suspected they would need this kind of activity. And Navy sent people to Columbia, and one of the men, Moorcroft, one of the men I just mentioned before, who was, by the way, who produced a wonderful first textbook on communication some years later, one of the best. I looked at it some years ago, it's still a good book. And that went back to the early 20th century. They started helping Armstrong, and he was teaching this course on radio and telegraphy and getting paid for that because he's now an assistant for the Navy. He finally filed his patent. It was granted, and he began to work for Pupin and Pupin's laboratory. By the way, that laboratory was honored some years back by the U.S. government. It's called Philosophy Hall of Columbia. It's not used as a laboratory anymore, but if you go by there, there's a plaque saying it's a national honorable place. They got a medal from the federal government. Now, there's a picture of the patent, the first page on the patent, which shows a vacuum tube on the top with feedback in it. I won't go into details on this. And it got a lot of coverage. His demos got extensive coverage. He wrote a paper for a journal called The Electrical World at that time, December 1914. And by the way, he was a member, as pointed out, of the radio club at that time. He was a radio amateur. He gave talks at IRE meetings. IRE is the Institute of Radio Engineers, which was founded just about that time. The electrical engineering community had an organization called AIEE, American Institute of Electrical Engineers. And that was primarily power. The radio engineers decided to set up another organization called IRE, Institute of Radio Engineers. Neither one of those exists. Not too long ago, the two of them combined to form what's now called IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. So the IRE is the Institute of Radio Engineers. And he produced a paper on this particular device, his patent, his regenerative receiver. And an eminent engineer at the time immediately wrote back saying this is a work of great significance. The first time to demonstrate and show why you got amplification and why you got regeneration or oscillations. And the IEEE had developed something called the Annual Medal of Honor to an outstanding engineer. And here he is, just several years out of undergraduate school, being a recipient of that honor. Now, a man named DeForest is one who'd really come up with the triodes for the first time, but he could not explain what made it oscillate. He couldn't explain what made it amplify. Armstrong, as a student, was able to do this. DeForest filed suit against Armstrong's patent. It went to long litigation, and believe it or not, 25 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court, by a split decision, 5-4, voted that DeForest was the first inventor, not Armstrong. So Armstrong, this is many years later, in a huff, took his Medal of Honor and sent it back to the IRE. I don't deserve it, obviously. They said, no way. We as engineers think that you're the man who won this, not DeForest, and they give it back to him. So the engineers agreed that he was the only guy, the first man, to explain the oscillations, to explain the amplification. DeForest had putted around with it. He didn't know what he was getting. So, but the Supreme Court still ruled that he was ahead. Armstrong made money anyway, by the way, because he, as he did with some of his other inventions, he turned them over to another RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, which had been founded just after, in 1918, just after World War I. And he became one of their, we'll see, one of their richest men, all the patents that he gave them. Now, 1916, 1919, 1918, the United States went into World War I. Armstrong joined the Signal Corps, became first a captain, then a major, went over to France, and this is where he invented the superheterodyne receiver, his second major invention. The one that's still used in all your AM receivers, all receivers worldwide have the superheterodyne process as part of it now. Now, another man in France called Levy claimed he'd invented it as well. They were probably independent inventions, but Armstrong has the patent for it. He came back after the war, back to Columbia as an assistant to Pupin, Michael Pupin, and he never left Columbia after that. Spent his entire life at Columbia University. That's why we're so proud of him, one of the key graduates of Columbia Electrical Engineering Department. And at this point, he began to work on reducing noise in radio systems. Atmospheric noise, tube noise, thermal noise, all the different noises that you get. Perennial problem with radio. There's a picture of Armstrong, an older man now, a few years older, as a major in France. And a distinguished looking, nice man, not as heavy as he became later on, as we'll see. All right, so he began work on trying to reduce noise in radio systems, a perennial problem. And this is some years later. If you look in the Columbia Library, which houses his papers, you find a document, a report to Pupin. He was reporting. He was an independent inventor working in Pupin's laboratory. So after all these years, from 1919 to 1933, he finally wrote a report on what he'd been doing. And the report says, in the spring of 1924, I resumed work on the old problem of the elimination of atmospheric disturbances, making some progress toward a solution, despite the widespread belief it was insoluble. Some of this work was presented in October 1927 before the IRE, and I've been continuously engaged on that problem. Now, what he had done, he thought he'd come up with a solution. He thought he'd come up with a way for eliminating noise by canceling it. Now, we now know, and it was pointed out right after, you can't cancel noise. Noise is random, and you can't cancel something like that. But he thought he had done that, and he wrote a paper on it. So here it is. He wrote the paper in 1927 on canceling radio static based on many experiments. There was an immediate rejoinder. There's a man named John Carson, an engineer, an eminent engineer working at AT&T Laboratories. In fact, it was already Bell Labs. Bell Labs was established in 1925, so he was working at Bell Labs at the time. And he showed it's impossible to cancel. You don't cancel noise, it's random. And he concluded with a statement I'm sure he's unhappy to have stated. It says, static like the poor will always be with us. It's unfortunate. And I say it was demolished by Armstrong later on with his work on FM. But anyway, that statement is in the paper if you read Carson's paper. And there it is. Now, let's come to FM. He began work on, his work really was on FM, wideband FM, but FM is erroneously thought to have been invented by Armstrong. It wasn't. In fact, not too long ago, I read somebody published a doctoral thesis on the history of FM, and I had to send the guy a letter, actually an email message saying, you made a mistake. Armstrong did not invent FM. FM was there for a long time. What Armstrong was invented was noise-reducing FM, or wideband FM. There was a book that came out of Princeton by a sociologist there, a wonderful book, very well done, on the history of media in the United States. And he says there also, FM was invented by Armstrong. So I had to send him an email message, and he replied to me saying he should have consulted his electrical engineering department first before putting that in print, after the fact. At any rate, its use had been explored early on. First, people thought in the early 1900s, maybe you can reduce the bandwidth using FM. Why? Because if you sweep the frequency slow enough, FM consists of sweeping frequencies, the theory was if you sweep it very slowly, it won't require much bandwidth. Well, the same man, John Carson, that we just talked about, early on wrote a very simple paper using simple trigonometry. We showed that FM, no matter how slowly you sweep it, has wider bandwidth than AM. If you sweep it it reduces to AM if you sweep very slowly, but then it gets wider and wider. He proved that. So people stopped being interested in FM for that reason. Then RCA, Radio Corporation of America, also used it because they thought maybe it might improve transmission. Remember, you're varying the frequency, not the amplitude. And when you transmit these signals, as we know nowadays with mobile systems, for example, they tend to fade in amplitude. Well, FM is not affected by amplitude. So the idea was, well, maybe if we use FM, we'll get something better. And they couldn't do it. It didn't work. So they'd given up most of that work and much less interest there. So Armstrong now, for years, worked to improve noise in radio systems. He was a consultant, by the way, to Radio Corporation. Whenever I have RCA now, I'm not referring to Radio Club of America. It's Radio Corporation of America. By the way, for those of you who don't know, how many of you know about the history of Radio Corporation of America? A few. All right. Repeat for those of you who don't. It was founded as a company in 1918, right after World War I, because until that time, Marconi of Europe, of Italy, had been the leading provider of radio systems. During the war, it became apparent that we couldn't let this go on. So the Secretary of Navy decided the United States ought to have its own company producing its own systems. So right after the war, they got the major companies like GE, like AT&T, and believe it or not, United Fruit Company, and several other companies that held patents in radio, to set up a company called Radio Corporation of America. Was in fact, FDR, Federal Delano Roosevelt, was Assistant Secretary of Navy at that time, and he was involved with this process. So they set up this company called RCA, which was given all the patents of radio by these companies voluntarily, and it was the patent holder. And RCA then began to develop radio systems, transmitters and receivers, beginning in 1918, Radio Corporation of America, and eventually became one of the largest companies in the world, tremendously large. If you wonder what happened to RCA, by the way, it was bought up by GE about 20 years ago, and unfortunately, I happened to be giving a talk at RCA laboratories, research laboratories in Princeton on the day it happened. And the word went out, and I'm talking to people like you here, and suddenly everybody's faces got grim because they knew that with RCA being bought by GE, this laboratory would have to be phased out. GE had a research laboratory in Schenectady. Why should it have a second one? And that's what happened, of course. So RCA sort of vanished, but it had been a major corporation, a major influence in radio. It set up NBC, it set up the other networks. All the radios were sold through RCA, a major corporation. And Armstrong became one of the leading stockholders, in fact, the richest stockholder of RCA, because they held his patents. Now, after working for years, Armstrong in 1927 to 1933, submitted 4 patents for FM. And all were granted on the same day, December 1933. And the last of the 4, called radio signaling, several of them had to do with improved circuits, improved limiters, important. But the significant one, called radio signaling, in 1933, was on wideband noise reducing FM. And it's critical to remember that. What he showed was you have to sweep the frequency much more than the bandwidth, much wider than the bandwidth, to get noise improvement. And that's what people forget. He did not invent FM. It had been around for many, many years. What he did invent was wideband noise reducing FM. Now, I won't have you go through this, but this is the circuit he showed as part of the patent. And this is the first page. You can't read it, so I'm going to take out the relevant information on the next page. Here. This is part in the patent. I have discovered that by imparting greater swing to the frequency of the transmitted wave, sweeping widely now, than can exist in the disturbance due to tube noise, that a very great improvement in transmission can be produced. And he accompanied this with a very intuitive approach in the patent as to why it works, and in the papers he wrote as to why it works. Now, once this happened, by the way, everybody started thinking about, can they show how this works? That work is still going on. It turns out FM is a nonlinear system. It requires nonlinear analysis to solve the problem, and people are still doing this kind of thing. A man named Steve Rice, an eminent mathematician at Bell Laboratories many years ago, wrote some papers trying to show why FM works the way, why wideband FM works the way it does. Alms did it very simply with vectors. So he's a very intuitive man. If you read his papers, you can see that. So there's a picture of Armstrong, much older now, heavier now than he was in the other pictures I've shown you, just about this particular time. Now, the invention was well received by the engineering community. He called the RCA engineers, he remember he's a consultant to them, and they were very impressed. By the way, all of this was kept under wraps. So if you try to find out, as I did, for example, exactly when did he invent it, there's no documentation. All we have is documentation that he sent to his patent attorneys. But the specific time, you can come up with an estimate, but he's very secretive about all of this, possibly because of the fact he had problems before with his patents. Then he gave a talk in 1935 at an IRE, Institute of Radio Engineers meeting, and finally published the paper. And that's a very important paper, and if you look at it, I say he shows you specifically why it happens using vector analysis. And I say many others following, including John Carson, wrote papers trying to prove mathematically why it works. But the best indication, the best way is Armstrong's approach, very intuitive approach as to why it works. Now, so that's a summary, basically. In 1920s, he had much activity to reduce radio static. 1928, his radio cancellation work was published, wrong, shown by John Carson to be wrong. Then beginning in 1931, he worked with RCA as a consultant to improve their designs. And finally, in 1931, that's my estimate, so I think he did it in September 1931 based on some papers I was able to read in his documentation, and the patent application in January 1933. So that's it. Now, what happened subsequently? Unfortunately, he went to RCA. David Sarnoff was the CEO at the time, chairman of the board and CEO, good friend of his. He had hired David Sarnoff's secretary, he married David Sarnoff's secretary as his wife. Good friends. He went to RCA to say, okay, we should set up an FM network now. It's much better. RCA wouldn't do it for 2 reasons. First, it would interfere with all the AM systems, all the AM networks, the NBC, CBS that they've set up. And they've all got a lot of money invested in that. They have a lot of money in the patents on radio receivers, AM receivers. Secondly, RCA was trying to develop television. and television requires wider bandwidth. Now the problem is, since FM requires noise-reducing FM requires a wider bandwidth, it can only operate at higher frequencies. You need enough spectrum for that, and that was in direct conflict with TV at the time. So RCA backtracked and wouldn't give them any help. They fought it out, and finally Armstrong took it to court and spent the rest of years of his life fighting RCA, fighting their lawyers, and he lost all his money as a result of this, and finally committed suicide by jumping off a tower, unfortunately. The one positive thing was later on, after he passed away, RCA gave his widow $1 million or so to pay for some of the patents, things like that. But it's a very sad conclusion. Anyway, let me point out, much of this work, I have to give acknowledgments that I've done, comes from the university archives and Armstrong papers. And some of the material comes from the only biography of his. And here it is right here. Somebody had asked me about it. This is an out-of-print biography called The Man of High Fidelity, Armstrong. Some additional work was published more recently in a book called Empire of the Air. And you might have seen a TV program on Channel 13 about that too. But the only real biography is this one right here. That's it. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
There's a new book out called The Network. I haven't heard of that. It was published last summer about the complex relationship between Sarnoff and Armstrong. I highly recommend it. Excellent book.
Okay. Well, parts of his life appear in various books, for example, Empire of the Air. But the only definitive biography is the one that's out of print now. Thank you. Other questions? In the back? Can you speak louder?
I just have a comment. Armstrong is, he received, and he was inducted into the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame when the Hall of Fame was created. And he gets credit for having created the concept of high fidelity in the consumer electronics industry. Prior to him coming along, the concept of hi-fi didn't really exist.
Thank you. Well, another thing also, back in 1983, the 100th anniversary of the founding of AIEE, the first electrical engineering organization, the proceedings of the then IEEE, remember AIEE disappeared, became IEEE, polled its readers, and they issued a list of the 10 most outstanding inventors of all time. Electrical engineering, and Armstrong was right up there. So the engineers recognized him too. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Inventors are different than everybody else.
I can't hear you.
Certainly Major Armstrong.
We can't hear you, Chip.
Can you give us a little more insight into his thought process, which obviously wasn't reductionist, it was not a to B to C to D and so on. It seems like he often understood where things were going conceptually and then worked to
I can't hear what you're saying.
Chip, why don't you come up here?
Come on.
We got white noise up here.
We need Armstrong.
We need Armstrong, exactly. There, put on stage together.
Sorry, Dr. Schwartz. Hey, can you give us a little more insight into Armstrong's thought process, which seems to be very different from how we're usually teaching students about being very reductionist, going from step A to B to C and D and so on?
The problem with his thought process is I say it's very secret. So, in fact, if you
Can you go back to the microphone, please, Professor? Thank you.
I'm not sure anybody can say anything about his thought process because even the engineers and assistants who worked with him were not privy to the innermost secrets. He was very secretive. So all we can say is based on the writings of Armstrong, he's very intuitive. So as I say, if you look at the FM system, he must have thought it through in some way using vector analysis. For example, in the paper, I don't know if you see it, he shows, for example, the signal he's transmitting is a vector, a straight line pointed up. He shows that noise is perpendicular to the vector. So what the signal factor of 10 or more, you get wonderful noise reduction. It drops below that, it falls apart. That comes exactly out of his little analysis. That appears in his paper. It's the simplest thing I've ever seen in my life. That's it. But beyond that, I'm not sure anybody can say anything, because never did he reveal how he did these things. I say even some of his best friends were out of this. The RCA engineers, for example, he was close to them. He consulted for them. He wouldn't let them in on this until he's all completed, the patent was accepted, and then he finally called them in. That's all I can say. Any other questions? That's it.
So, I just, realized I grew up in IIT reading the books by you, so thank you. I am who I am because I'm reading the books from you.
That's well appreciated. Thank you very much.